Welcome back. We're going to dive into this last segment of Chapter 4 and going to talk about, I guess, I'm not sure I would call it my favorite topic, but going to talk about government and taxes. And taxes, as they say in the text, is an indirect mandatory payment to the government associated with an economic activity. You can have federal taxes, you can have state taxes, you can have county taxes, you can have city taxes. Just it feels like, and I can remember being in graduate school at Ohio State. So, and as a graduate student, you were paid a monthly stipend to help professors teach classes, and I would get that monthly, I'd get my check at the end of the month, and you'd look at it, and I was taxed by the federal government. I was taxed by the state of Ohio. We lived in an area called Westerville. I had a Westerville city tax I had to pay. I had a Franklin County tax I had to pay because Columbus was in Franklin County, and I worked in Franklin County because that's where Ohio State was, and I had to pay the Columbus city tax. So every time I turned around, I was paying a tax. And that's on the income tax. And when you're paying that many taxes, you can just imagine what it does to your disposable income. Those of you that, since this is an undergraduate class, I'm assuming most of you are living in the state of Tennessee somewhere, and at least in the state of Tennessee, you don't have any state income tax. So your disposable income has the opportunity of putting you in a better shape when it comes to purchasing power than a lot of other states. You've got, I don't know, we lived in California for about 20 years, and the tax revenue that you had to support in California was almost unbelievable, and then ended up moving and living in Buffalo for 12 or 13 years. And so the state of New York may even be worse than the state of California, but two states in the United States that just will suck you dry on taxes. It is just the tax burden that you're paying in those two states, it's just ridiculous. So if they provide you a list, I think, in the text, and so you start kind of down that list, and you've got a sales tax, and I don't know, the sales tax here in the state of Georgia is 8%. I don't know what it is, and that seemed like it's 8 1/4 or 8 3/4 or something like that in the state of Tennessee, and that's just charged on everything that you purchase. You've got what they call an excise tax, and you usually see excise taxes, and we'll get into it a little later, but it's kind of what they call pay at the pump. So gasoline you buy has an excise tax, cigarettes, alcohol, cell phones have an excise tax. So you've got all of these excise taxes built into a lot of the commodities you buy. If you own property, if you own an automobile, you're going to pay some property tax on your automobile. If you own a home, you're going to pay property tax. If you have, a building that you maybe work out of, and, for your business, you're going to have, kind of a property tax on that business tax. So, and that's where the property tax is where a lot of, at least counties, generate the majority of their revenue. Property tax is a huge generator. If you're in an area like, Nashville's in Davidson County. If you're in, so if you think about Davidson County, you think of the sales tax generated in Davidson County, and you also think about the property tax generated in Davidson County. You've got import tax. French wine comes to mind on an import tax. Anything made overseas that, it's being brought in. So you may be paying an import tax on that. Do you have a head tax? Typically, you think of a head tax as Staten Island Ferry that goes out to the Statue of Liberty. Probably got a head tax. It's based on per person, usually per person. In Southern California, there's Coronado Bridge. It goes from San Diego over to Coronado Island, and they used to have theirs was a head tax, but it was based on, on the car. So as you went into the island, you paid $1 per car that went in. So they viewed that as as a head tax. You've got estate taxes. So I don't know about estate taxes. That's going to vary from state to state. So I'll just say that estate taxes are typically what you're paying the government when, you know, somebody, you know, dies or passes away and they leave you some property. So, and that's going to vary from state to state. So it's a little difficult to get into state taxes. And you start to think about while all of these taxes work in different ways, different economic activities, different units of measure, but they all have something in common, and it's a way that governments generate revenues to do things like pay for roads and schools and security and sidewalks and street lights and all of the government programs that they go to fund. So taxes is kind of the freight you're paying for living in a particular area and being afforded the opportunity to access some of these free government services. And the text talks about how taxes work, and they even though they don't get into detail about a lot of them, they do talk about this excise tax. And an excise tax, according to the text, is a set amount for each good or service sold per unit, usually collected from the seller. And it's built into the price. You pay at the pump. If you look at the state of Tennessee, if you're looking at gasoline, I want to say it's like 18 cents is the federal excise tax, and another 20 cents is, you know, Tennessee state tax. So that's built into the price. So there's what, 28, that's 38 cents built into the price of the gas you're buying, plus, you know, tack on sales tax on top of that. And it's what they call pay at the pump. So most individuals pull up, whether you get your gas at Costco, Sam's Club, Shell, you know, Chevron, you pull up and it's, you know, X number of dollars at the pump. It's, you know, $3.49 9/10. They always throw that 9/10 in there rather than just rounding it to, you know, 35 cents. I guess they want you to think you're getting a deal. But anyway, it's already built into the price. And unless you go out to Google and start Googling it, you don't really know what the magnitude of that excise tax is. So if you're interested in any particular state, you can get out there and, you know, type out on Google and say, you know, what's the excise tax for gasoline in, you know, Alabama or Georgia or Kentucky or Tennessee. And then also you can get the federal excise tax. And I think you can do the same thing for like cell phone service. You can do the same thing for alcohol. You can figure out, just doing a few quick Google searches, you can figure out what the level of excise tax is. And what happens to the excise tax, it increases the cost of the good or service. And as you increase, remember, supply moves upward, demands downward. What happens is if you increase the cost of the good or service, the factors of production of that good or service, what's that supply curve going to do? That supply curve is going to decrease and it's going to start moving to the left. It's going to shift that supply curve to the left. So again, you're talking about an excise tax is a what? What have we talked about? Supply shifter. Going to shift that thing to the left or shift it to the right, but in an excise tax, it's going to shift it to the left. And basically, it's a tax that discourages the activity being taxed. And people, you know, kind of wonder about, they can understand excise tax on alcohol, cigarettes, gentlemen's clubs. But when it comes to gasoline, you know, it's kind of like, you know, gasoline is, I don't want to say it's a necessity, but it could be a fairly significant chunk of your budget because, you know, most people drive their car to work. So they have to buy gasoline to get to work. During COVID, it wasn't that big a deal because the economy was shut down and most people were working from home. If they were lucky enough to still have a job, but they were working from home. So is there some ulterior motive with the green economy trying to increase excise tax, trying to discourage people from having gasoline burning vehicles and moving to electric vehicles? So that's kind of the latest conspiracy theory I saw, bouncing around the internet. So whether it's true or not, that's what an excise tax does. It tries to discourage some type of economic activity. And so what happens is, on an excise tax, the price the buyers pay at the pump goes up, but the price the seller receives goes down. So the seller tries to pass some of that tax on to the buyer. And so let's say, and I think in the book, maybe they had a $2 excise tax. I think it's what they were using, talking about kombucha, or I don't know, some kind of a liquid refreshment, I guess. And they, as they went through all of the examples, what happened at the end of the day? That $2 excise tax, the buyer ended up paying an extra dollar, and the seller ended up receiving a less, $1 less. And they do have a little formula in the text that said the price the buyer pays equals the price the seller receives plus the tax. So and if you want to figure out what the tax is, then again, it's what your math teacher used to bang into your head, when you're in high school. All you have to do is rearrange terms. So the price the buyer pays minus the price the seller receives, that is equal to the tax. So a little formula, you can play around with it, you can shuffle the terms, but at the end of the day, an excise tax, it's going to impact both the buyer and the seller. And they actually talk about it driving a wedge between the buyer and the seller. And if you go to the example in the book, and they talk about, they've got the supply curve and the demand curve, and they've got that equilibrium price, and you put your finger on there and you move it out through there, and you actually come up with the price the buyer pays and the price the seller pays. It's actually a pretty neat little trick. I hadn't seen that done before. But if you want to play around with the excise tax and that wedge method, because the tax, does drive a wedge between the buyer and the seller. So it's actually a good way to kind of think about an excise tax. And it's I don't want to say it's similar to a Social Security tax, but if you think about Social Security tax, who pays it? Social Security tax is what, 15%, something along those lines. Who pays it? The employee pays half of it. The employer pays half of it. If you work for a company, if you are a consultant like myself, if I, when I, based on the profit I make, I pay the whole freight for myself. So I'm paying all the Social Security tax on, based on the income and the profit that I make. But if you're working for a company, if you work for Fisk, if you work for McDonald's or Starbucks or whomever you work for in Nashville, the employer's paying half of it and you're paying half of it. And then they kind of wrap up the taxes, talking about why taxes, and that the reason they've got taxes is the government has to operate. The government, again, it's supplying you, and we talked about it, schools and roads and parks and security and street lights and, public schools and welfare programs and, government subsidies and all of these types of services that the government provides, whether it's federal, state, local, it's got to be paid for some way. And so individuals, you, me, other individuals are paying for it through a process of taxation. The ones I really like when it talks about taxes, it's this paternalism tax. And that's basically saying the government knows more about what's good for you or what you need to do than you do. That makes you feel really great, doesn't it? That the government knows more than you do. And so they are taxing, alcohol and tobacco and, gambling and different, I don't want to say, hate to call them vices, but the government looks at them as vices. So they're taxing different vices, trying to discourage you from participating in these types of activities. And it, supposedly, it improves market efficiency. It improves social well-being. And, when we talked earlier about floors and ceilings, and, that's supposed to help the well-being of employees with the minimum wage, and, subsidies with farmers, and, rent controls with, and kind of the low-income population. And all of those programs, are driven, at least with the ceilings and the floors, are driven with some type of taxation. And then one tax that you don't hear much about is the last tax they talk, and they talk at a rent-seeking tax. And it's when you or I have a company producing goods and services, and to help us become more competitive, we reach out to our local legislators and said, hey, how about implementing let's say an import tax? Let's say I want to start want to plant some grapes, and I want to start bottling wine. I might reach out to my legislator and say, hey, can you help me become more competitive in the wine industry by imposing import tax on, and maybe it's Malbec, and maybe it's a wine. My main competition is coming out of Argentina or South America or somewhere. Can you put an import tax on those wines? It makes me more competitive. It makes the wine coming out of South America more expensive, and it makes me more competitive. So that's what we're going to try to wind up with chapter 4. And the next time, I think the next chapter in microeconomics, I can't remember. I think they're talking about elasticity. So next time we get together, we'll talk about elasticity and responses. So, thanks for joining, and we'll talk to you soon.